Good morning. I hope you had a good rest. I hope that this weekend has been fulfilling for you. And now we come to a close. At least my bit of it comes to a close. I thought I'd start by just stepping back a bit from what I've been saying and share with you from a sort of slightly broader perspective what it is that I'm trying to do, what this secular Buddhist project might look like. And one way in which I find it helpful to describe this is as rethinking the Dharma from the ground up. I sometimes think of Buddhism like a very exotic and complex Bavarian castle with lots of turrets and wings and fortifications and all sorts of very intriguing architectural features. And so easily do we become somehow fascinated, maybe mesmerized by some of these superstructural elements that we forget really, or we fail to appreciate on what ground this edifice has been erected. So rethinking the Dharma from the ground up is with much respect, with care, putting to one side the superstructure and trying to recover what the ground floor looks like and possibly what the basement has hidden in it as well. And this approach is twofold. On the one hand, it's a project that seeks to recover the earliest strata of teachings that we can, with some degree of confidence, date back to the period of the Buddha himself, or if not, shortly afterwards. And in this regard, we are much helped by the work of a number of scholars who in the last 50, 100 years now have been sort of chiseling away at the canonical texts and learning to differentiate the layerings of discourse within the early canons. One must be, I think, very clear that the Pali canon, for example, which is broadly speaking a collection of the earliest texts, does not speak with a single voice. There are certainly many different voices that are audible in those texts. And not all of them can be granted the same degree of antiquity. So the discipline that we draw upon here is philology, the study of the language itself. That's often the most useful key to teasing apart the different layers and strata of the text. The second prong in this approach is to recover a clearer sense of the Buddha's own historical period. In other words, these teachings that we find in the earliest layers of the canon were not just spoken in a vacuum. It's not as though one day the Buddha sat beneath a tree, became enlightened, and then just started to speak, but he spoke to people. And we can trace now through, again, a close analysis of the text, a broad sense of how his life unfolded after the awakening, the different kings he had to deal with, different religious figures, who were in dialogue with him. And we can slowly piece together something about the movements of his life. And towards the end of his life, the last 7 years or so, we can reconstruct in actually quite some detail. But more importantly, we need to draw, or what enables us to do this with more confidence, is the work of another group of scholars, historians of this period. And the historians, of course, also work in tandem with archaeologists. And in the last 20, 30 years, I think we've gained a much clearer picture of the sort of world the Buddha lived in. And this allows us to recover something of his humanity. A similar movement, of course, occurred in Christianity. But this started happening with the writings of people like David Strauss, I think it was. The search for the historical Jesus is what it's loosely called. And the work of, again, if we want to make some Christian comparisons, the work of the Jesus Seminar is very inspirational for this project. I'm sure you're aware of it. If not, you can look it up. But again, it's a similar two-pronged approach. Critical analysis of in this case, the Gospels, trying to determine which passages have a more or less likelihood of being the word of Jesus, and likewise, the historical study of that period in time in Palestine. So we're doing something very similar in the Buddhist world of scholarship too. We've also, through the work of Richard Gombrich, Heinz Beckert, are fairly confident now that the Buddha lived about 80 years nearer our time than Buddhist tradition has maintained. His dating now is 480 to 400, roughly, whereas previously it was 563 to 483. Now that might sound, not terribly interesting, but without going into detail, it somehow brings the Buddha closer into our historical reach. It makes him a contemporary of Socrates. It makes him a person who died only 75 years before Alexander invaded India. So all of these factors together afford us a clearer sense of who this man Gautama was, a clearer sense of the intellectual, spiritual, religious, economic, political, and social environment in which he worked, and a clearer sense of what elements within the early teachings are more likely to have actually been spoken by him. Obviously, this is a work in progress, and scholars, being scholars, like to disagree with each other. So there's all kinds of debates and disagreements, and that's healthy. But for the secular Buddhist project, this scholarship is utterly indispensable. And it affords us I think, very powerful tools that can enable us to rethink the Dharma from the ground up. In other words, we can put to one side, again, with respect, a lot of the superstructure of later Indian Buddhist thought, of how Buddhism evolved later in East Asia, in China, Japan, in Central Asia, in Tibet, recognizing that these are totally legitimate evolutions of the early Buddhist tradition that emerged in response to the needs of people in those cultures, in those times in history. And it would be entirely irresponsible and I think inappropriate to somehow say they got it wrong. I'm not saying that at all. But rather what I think one finds is that there's a richness within the early Buddhist canon that has not yet exhausted the possibilities of generating new narratives. I feel that the early canon, in some ways, is the most radical. It's the least inflected by later Indian metaphysics and philosophy and epistemology and so on. And in a strange way, I find it speaks more directly to my condition today. Again, I'm aware that I'm reading into, or I risk reading into these early texts, my own biases, my own preferences, my own prejudgments, and I must be very cautious there. But again, modern scholarship is very good at waving those flags that, to warn us against those sorts of biases. But nonetheless, if we take the whole picture into account, I think we have an adequate basis for re-articulating the Buddha's teaching in a way that is both true to its source materials and hopefully is also able to voice itself in a language that can speak to the conditions of modernity. So yesterday I spoke about secular Buddhism from one aspect in terms of its concerns with this world. Here we can think of secular Buddhism as based upon certain philological and historical scholarship. And hopefully the two will converge in some way. And pretty much everything that I've been sharing with you over this weekend is an example of my own attempts to perform this kind of work. And it has led, as we've seen, to somewhat unorthodox ideas. Replacing the Four Noble Truths with the Four Tasks is probably the most unorthodox position I've taken. But on the other hand, I find that in that reading yields a great deal of insight that is further corroborated by other textual sources within the canon. It's not just a one-off idea, in which case, we would be justifiably dubious about it. But I feel that over the course of the last years, in collaboration with my colleagues and peers who are interested in the same studies, we're beginning to arrive at another way of understanding the Dharma. Some scholars now are talking of a field called early Buddhism. And next year, together with John Peacock, Christina Feldman, and Akinchano Weber, who are all Vipassana teachers and scholars in this area, we're going to launch an institute for the study and practice of early Buddhism, which will be based in the UK and run courses in Europe. We have a website, bodhi-institute.org, if you want to see what we're up to. But what you will also find on that website are quite a number of texts that, again, further explicate this approach to the Dharma. I'd like this morning to try to bring together some of the threads that we've explored this weekend, and look in particular at the nature of the path, the Eightfold Path, the middle way, and how that becomes a framework for a sangha, a community, and the possibility of a culture. A culture I use in preference to another religion. I like to think of this work as contributing to the emergence of a culture of awakening, rather than another Buddhist religious movement. A culture, in that sense, that extends beyond the borders of what are formally recognized as Buddhist groups and traditions and institutions. And again, once more, Unitarian Universalism is a wonderful framework to pursue these kinds of ideas, not just in theory, but also as a form of practice. The first step of the Eightfold Path is called Sammaditthi. And this is usually translated as right view. I'm going to translate it as complete vision. And the core text that informs my understanding of what complete vision is a dialogue between the Buddha and a man called Kaccanagotta. The Buddha was living at Savatthi. Then the good Kaccanagotta approached him, sat down to one side and said, "You say complete vision, sir. In what respects is vision complete?" And the Buddha replies, "By and large, Kaccana, this world relies on the duality of it is and it is not. But one who sees the arising of the world as it happens with complete intelligence has no sense of it is not about the world. And one who sees the ceasing of the world as it happens with complete intelligence has no sense of it is about the world." Again, this is a dense text, so I'll tease it out a bit. The duality of it is and it is not is basically the duality that is built into the very grammar of language itself. A and not A, the law of the excluded middle. And yet the Buddha here is saying that if we premise our understanding of the world, loka, we spoke about that the other day, on this distinction, something either is or it is not, we'll actually limit ourselves in understanding with what he calls complete intelligence, or this again, it's samma panya. Panya, wisdom, we spoke about that yesterday. Samma, complete, wisdom, intelligence. If we see the world with complete intelligence, we realize that these categories, these fundamental categories of language, are inadequate to capture the flux and flow of life itself. So the person who sees the arising of the world as it happens, in other words, when you witness with your senses, with your body, the emergence or the appearance of something, you cannot entertain the idea that it is not. It's present. But equally, you also are aware that after a certain time, what has appeared or what has emerged will fade away and change and become something else. And once you start noticing that process, you realize that the category it is inadequate too. Being, non-being, it is not, fail to capture the fluidity, the transitoriness, the arising and passing of what is going on in experience here and now. A simple example might be, let's say a plant. You start with a seed, and you plant the seed, and it then sprouts, and then it grows, and then it springs out leaves, and then it produces a flower. And in terms of our linguistic categories, we would think that the seed is one thing and the flower is another. They're completely different. But if you observe minutely, maybe as a biologist or a botanist would observe, how the seed mutates slowly into a sprout, and the sprout mutates slowly into a small plant, and the plant mutates into a flowering bush, you cannot draw a line where you can say, that's where the seed stopped and the sprout began. That's where the shoot stopped and the flower began. There is a seamless, unbroken continuity that is not reducible to the conceptual categories of thought. Of course, the Buddha speaks. The Buddha uses language. The Buddha uses the words it is and it is not. But that's simply a given in human discourse and communication. The problem is that we literalize concepts and words and ideas and overlay them onto the fluid fabric of life itself. So this complete vision is a vision that somehow is open to the whole picture of the arising and the passing of things, and resists the temptation to isolate and to separate and to pin down with a kind of ontological finality the nature of reality. And then the same text continues, by and large, Kachana, this world is bound to its prejudices and habits. But a person with complete vision does not get caught up in habits, fixations, prejudices, or biases of the mind. He or she is not fixated on myself. He or she does not doubt that when something is occurring, it is occurring. And when it has come to an end, it has come to an end. His or her knowledge is independent of others. Now, we don't have time to unpack that in much detail here, but you can see how this complete vision is not just a kind of philosophical perspective, but it also has consequences for our psychological or our affective relationship to life too. There's something about this concretization, this isolation of being and not being, that also becomes a foundation for habit, fixation, prejudice, bias, in which we create unnecessary separations between ourselves, between different communities, for example, and we become locked into a world in which conflict and violence becomes almost inevitable. That, I think, is what's going on here. In these respects, Karchana, such a person's vision is complete. And I hope you agree with me that complete works a lot better here than right view, as opposed to wrong view. That seems weirdly to actually reinforce the very problem that is being criticized. So here we have, I think, a very clear example of how the way the Buddha thinks is that of what we would call in the West, following people like Whitehead, a process thinking. It's not a thinking that assumes the priority of things or states, but is a vision of process. And here too, I feel a certain support or justification in thinking of the four tasks as a process, whereas the four truths are four distinct and separate claims as to what is the case. And my sense is that for whatever reasons, and I think a lot of it had to do with the gradual institutionalization of the Dharma into what we call Buddhism, the religion, that we shifted from a process way of thinking into a thing or state-based or truth-based way of thinking. And in this way, I find it very helpful and also very much in accord with the passage that I've just read, to think of the four tasks as an ongoing feedback loop, as I said. And this is very much a processual way of engaging with this core practice. It's processual. It's ongoing. And another illustration of this is in the notion of self. It's commonly thought and taught in Buddhism that there is no self. The Buddha didn't have a self, and a good Buddhist isn't supposed to have one either. But this again is at odds with the very notions that we've just looked at. Is there a self? Is there not a self? And Buddhism seems to have opted for the fact that there is no self. That, to me, is dualistic thinking. In fact, I think, and again, most translators, including Bhikkhu Bodhi and others now, have stopped translating anatta as no self and translated, I think, a lot more accurately as not self. I mean, it might sound like a subtle distinction, perhaps it is, but it's not a question of realizing that there is no self, but it's a question of observing, moment to moment, the experience that's unfolding within and around us and realizing that none of this is me or mine in any essential way. There's a famous dialogue between the Buddha and a man called Vacchagotta. And Vacchagotta comes to the Buddha and he says, Mr. Gautama, is there a self? And it's the same word as it is, ati. Does the self exist? Is there a self? And the Buddha remains silent. And then Vacchagotta says, well, in that case, there is no self. And the Buddha remains silent. And then Vacchagotta stands up and walks away in a huff, not getting anywhere. He wants an answer. He wants a black, it either is or is not. Buddha refuses to respond. After Vacchagotta has gone, Ananda turns to the Buddha and said, well, why didn't you tell him something? Why didn't you give him an answer? Come on. We had a good, potential convert there, and you let him go. And the Buddha's reply is, if I had said there is a self, that would have encouraged within him the extreme of permanence and eternalism. And if I had said to him, there is not a self, there is no self, that would have encouraged him in the other dead end or extreme of nihilism. So that very clearly, I think, articulates the Buddha's processual understanding of self. He doesn't negate self. One of my favorite verses in the Dhammapada says, just as a farmer irrigates a field, just as an arrowsmith fashions an arrow, just as a carpenter shapes a block of wood, so the wise person tames the self. There's no denial of self. Self is now being used in a totally non-problematic but processual way. The self is like a field. The self is like a barren field that when it's irrigated can then flourish and generate a harvest. The self is like the unformed components of an arrow that when integrated and put together can achieve direction and focus and purpose and be on target, as it were. And the self is like an unshaped piece of wood that a skilled carpenter or artisan can transform into either a useful piece of furniture or a beautiful statue. This clearly shows the idea that the Buddha's understanding of self, in other words, the person, the individual, is a work in progress too. We are, as it were, unfinished. We are unfinished products. Our practice is very much the shaping and the fashioning of who we are, the cultivation of another way of being in the world that is transformative in terms of who we feel ourselves to be, who others then come to understand as a person who's grown, who's evolved, who's matured, or whatever it might be. Now, the person who acquires this complete vision enters the stream of the path. And remember, we saw it in the last couple of days, how in the four-task model, there's the embracing of life, the letting go of reactivity, beholding the stopping of reactivity, and that affords an opening that leads into a path. And the first step on that path is called complete vision. So the stopping of reactivity allows that possibility. In other words, reactivity, whether it be attachment or hatred or opinionatedness, is basically still locked into the idea of it is and it is not, I want this, I don't want that, etc., etc. This is right, that is wrong. But in that moment of non-reactive openness, we let go of that whole way of relating to ourselves and the world, and that leads us into another way of living here and now. The expression the Buddha uses for a person who enters the path is sotapatti, which means a stream entrant, a stream entrant. And when he's asked, well, what is this stream you're talking about? He says the stream is the Eightfold Path. And what do you mean by a stream entrant? He says a stream entrant is someone for whom the Eightfold Path has become their own. So clearly he's not saying there's no one there. It's become their own. You own the path. It's yours. It's not something you just sort of believe in or aspire to. It's now become your own. It's become a living thing. It's become a flow. And I think the notion of stream is a very potent metaphor. Let's just think about that for a moment. A stream flows. A stream, unlike a pond, is something that runs. It's not stagnant. Arguably, we can metaphorically understand what it's like for our lives to be stagnant, to not be moving. And what happens in a stagnant pond is it soon gets rather cluttered and blocked. You get all kinds of weeds growing and so on, and it gets very dark and gloomy. Whereas a flowing stream, when the energies of our life are somehow released, is one in which we feel very vitally alive. But the metaphor of a stream is also very much a metaphor of life itself. Flowing water. Water is what nourishes all forms of living creature in this world. It's also, I think, striking that Mara, we've spoken of, the demonic, the devil, is sometimes called Namuchi in the Pali text. Namuchi refers to a Vedic god who's a kind of demonic god, and Namuchi is the one, and this is what the word means, the one who holds back the water. And in India, he's the drought demon. And if you've lived in India, and you're very much aware, especially at the Buddha's time, of how utterly dependent the communities were on the monsoon, on the falling of the yearly rains that allow the crops to be watered for people basically to survive. So just as Namuchi holds back the water, stream entry is that moment when the water is released and is allowed to flow. So these kinds, I think that the Buddha had a genius for metaphor. The barren field, the arrow, the block of wood, the stream. And these are images taken from ordinary life. I think there's a parallel here with Jesus in the Gospels, who likewise teaches very often through parable and metaphor. Some scholars have argued that one of the criteria that could help us determine whether a teaching is of an earlier or a later date is the extent to which it relies on metaphor. As Buddhism evolved into a religious system, it became much less metaphorical and much more discursive and abstract. There's something about metaphor that requires a quality of imagination to see and present ordinary things and to transform them into examples or ways of understanding something about how we might live our lives ethically, creatively, and so on. Another element of the stream, though, is that a stream is not the same as a flood. It's not that the water is released and it just sort of goes there everywhere and basically just fizzles out and disappears and gets absorbed by the earth. But a stream flows because it's held within its banks. So when the Buddha defines stream entry in a text called the Sottapatti Samyutta, the Connected Discourses on Stream Entry, he speaks of it as having four qualities. Lucid confidence in the Buddha, lucid confidence in the Dharma, lucid confidence in the Sangha, and the cultivation of the virtues that are dear to the noble ones. That's a stream entrant. And what that shows is that stream entry, or the path, is focused towards the realization of certain core values. The Buddha does not refer just to the historical Buddha, but it refers to the capacity all of us have to be more fully awake. In other words, Gautama is really just an historical exemplar of an awake person. And his teaching, the Dharma, or his instruction, might be a better way to phrase that, is a way of life that, when practiced, can lead to a more conscious, awake, empathetic, wise, all of the other virtues we speak of, that's open and available to all. And this process, though, is not something that occurs purely in the privacy of your own meditation when you're sitting on your cushion, but it's a process that is held and nurtured by friendships, by Sangha. So the Eightfold Path, when one is, as it were, engaging with this path, the path is the Dharma, if you wish. The path is focused and directed towards awakening, and that process is nurtured and supported by community. Now, of course, probably many of you are familiar with these ideas as the three refuges. And that, of course, has become the sort of entry ritual into the Buddhist church, is you take refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. But in a sense, deeper than the formal religious idea of identifying as being a Buddhist, there is this way of life that is ongoing moment to moment. One of the things my Tibetan teacher, Geshe Rabten, said that always stayed with me is he says, whenever you practice meditation or you practice a Buddhist virtue, you are taking refuge in that moment. Refuge is not a one-off ritual, and then you belong to the club, but actually it's something that we, in a way, are involved in every moment of our practice. And this, I think, accords very well with the idea here of stream entry as this ongoing, focused flow of life in which we're living our lives without impediment, in free flow. On the other hand, when you go, pretty much every Buddhist tradition today, particularly in the Theravada schools, in the Vipassana movement, and also as I was taught it in the Tibetan tradition, stream entry is not described like that at all. Stream entry is described as the loss of three fetters. And in that sense, it sort of turns into a much more private kind of experience. It's true that we can find some very old sources in the canon for that idea. So I think we can use both approaches to enrich our understanding of stream entry. Stream entry is not, as is often presented today, as a rather lofty attainment that only people who have studied and practiced for a great deal of time, preferably professional monks and so on, might attain. The Buddha clearly understands it as a kind of conversion experience. Your life turns around at a certain point and you focus it on values that now become conscious and explicit, and you seek to realize those values in conflict often with the inertia of habits, fixations, and biases of the mind. In that sense, it becomes an ascesis, a practice. There's a tension involved. It's not as though you enter the stream of the Eightfold Path and then everything is hunky-dory till the cows come home. It's an ongoing struggle. The Buddha's not psychologically naive. But we can also understand this process perhaps in a more psychological way, but also it taps into, I think, something very much to do with ethics again, is that stream entry is experienced as the falling away or the loss of three things. The first is vanity. This is sometimes translated very unsatisfactorily to my mind as personality view. Sakaya Ditti. Ditti means view, Sakaya actually means the whole body. I've puzzled as to how to translate that, and I think perhaps vanity captures it quite well. A person who's had a moments of experience in which they realize that they're not their body, they're not their mind, they're not their thoughts, they're not their feelings, they are simply a flux of process of body and mind, that they are subject to sickness and aging and death. Once you really embrace that dimension of who you are, it's very difficult to feel vain and proud. I think that begins to fall away. The next thing, or the other thing that falls away is doubt. Now, by doubt here, I think we mean something like vacillation. The Tibetans have a good image for this. They say it's like trying to sew a piece of cloth with a two-pointed needle. In other words, you jam. It's a stuckness. It doesn't work. But when one has had a moment at which the path has opened up for you, a moment at which reactivity has died down and you have been open to new possibilities, and you know that deeply within yourself, even though it may not last for very long, you've achieved a certain openness, and I think we would quite legitimately call this a kind of faith, a certain trust, a certain confidence that this is possible. And that gives you the kind of impetus to keep going. It might be that you'll spend still time feeling confused and angry and depressed, but there's a part of you, maybe just a glimmer sometimes, that knows, not believes, but knows that you can live otherwise. But the one I want to concentrate on is the third one, the third fetter that falls away as you enter the stream. And this is called Silabata. It's usually translated as attachment to rites and rituals. Now, in Bhikkhu Bodhi's recent translation of the Samyutta Nikaya, he translates it, and I think completely correctly, as virtues and vows. Not rites and rituals, but virtues and vows. My own preferred translation would be moral rules. Sila is a well-known Buddhist term that means morality or virtue, maybe even ethics. I think morality. And bhatta is again a very old Sanskrit Pali word that refers very often to how in Brahmanic rituals you have to follow very precise sequences of instruction in performing the ritual correctly. So it's rules, ordered rules. So together, sila, bhatta, moral rules. That falls away in entering the stream. And I would interpret this as a shift from a legalistic ethics to a situational ethics. And again, I'm borrowing that language from Christian theology. I think it's very helpful. We can think of ethics as being legalistic. In other words, we have an a priori belief that there are a set of moral rules that we accord our actions to. And any precept-based ethic, anything like, for example, the Torah, all religions have developed complicated rules that try to cover all possible scenarios in human life. And if you're facing a moral dilemma, basically what you need to do is look up the rule book and see what is the right thing to do. And you can quote the Quran or the Torah or the Vinaya in Buddhism, and it gives you the right answer, and then you can feel morally at ease. You've done the right thing. The fact that it might have made things an awful lot worse doesn't really matter. You've done the right thing. It's a very well-known human way of coming to terms with the anguish of moral choice. My sense is that the Buddha's Eightfold Path is a process in which you let go of an attachment to precepts and rules and so on. Now, many people feel this is very dangerous, right? There's no, then you can do what you want. Now, this I think is a failure to understand that ethical behavior is not either a question of following moral rules, which we might find to be very limiting, and if we don't have any moral rules, we end up with no rules at all, and this is technically called antinomianism, a moral life in which there are no guiding principles at all. You just do what you want. You do the first thing that occurs to you. There is no framework whatsoever. Whereas a situational ethic is a middle way. It's not adhering in a kind of literalistic way to moral rules, but it's also not without principles that guide one's actions. And the principles that guide one's actions are those of love and wisdom, the virtues, in other words. So when you face a moral dilemma, you don't say, what is the right thing to do here? You ask instead, what is the wisest thing to do? What is the most loving thing to do? That becomes your guide. But at the same time, you are conscious that every moral dilemma is unique and unrepeatable. A real moral dilemma is one for which there is no precedent. And the reason for that is because moral dilemma are specific and unique to a given occasion. That's why legalism doesn't work in the end. We have to acknowledge the specificity and uniqueness of each case. And this leads us, and I agree, it's not easy, because we have to take a risk. We have to take responsibility in what we choose to say or do. And we have to accept that we might get it wrong. We might make things worse. But it strikes me that if we can somehow find the resource of stability, of clarity, of reflection, of understanding, the wisdom of our own experience over the years, that this is what will guide us in our moral choices, our moral decisions. But perhaps at the very root of what guides us is the refinement of an empathetic awareness, without which I think an authentic ethical life is probably not possible. And I did try to remember this passage yesterday evening, but I was very tired and I couldn't get it right if I had found it. This is also from the Sutta Nipata, which is generally believed to be the earliest layer of the Pali Canon, where the Buddha says, as I am, so are they. As they are, so am I. Comparing oneself with others, one should not kill or cause to kill. Do unto others as you would have them do to yourself. But this is a text that goes back probably to about the 4th or 5th century BC. I feel that also we know that there are precedents in Judaic tradition for this idea that predate Jesus. I think it's really the foundation of ethics. And I feel that the practice of mindfulness, the practice of awareness, as we mentioned yesterday, is not just about becoming more aware of the rising of sensations in the body and so on, but it leads us into a greater self-awareness that, particularly when our preoccupation with me and mine begins to fade and dissolve, opens us up to the understanding, the empathetic understanding that everyone else is just like me. That just as I feel, you feel. Just as I am embodied, you are embodied. Just as I have anxieties, you have anxieties. Just as I wish to be happy, you wish to be happy. And that's the foundation, I feel, that provides us with the kind of empathetic sensitivity on which we can practice a situational ethic, an ethic that is no longer tied to doing the right thing, following the rules. It's an ethics of care, and it's an ethics of risk. And my time is up. That seems to be a good place to stop. Yeah, there's still more to go, but never mind. I think that's a good moment to stop. Thank you very much.